The Cold War had already thrown the world into such a hazardous arms race that nuclear destruction was no longer an offing, but a daunting possibility. Both had stockpiled weapons, operated under the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, and played a deadly game of brinkmanship. But in October 1962, the stakes escalated to an unprecedented level. When Soviet nuclear missiles were found in Cuba, 90 miles from the US coast, the world entered its most dangerous moment ever. A wrong move, a miscalculation, or a failure in diplomacy could have led to a nuclear war that would have eliminated millions. For 13 days, the world held its breath as two superpowers stood face to face, closer to disaster than ever before. How did the crisis start? What means were used to diffuse tension? And above all, how did the world avoid catastrophe at the last minute? The early 1960s witnessed Cuba as a significant point in the Cold War. The island, situated 90 miles off the coast of Florida, had already caused much concern when Fidel Castro came to power and moved close to the Soviet Union. When the Cuban government took over communism, it became a base of Soviet influence in the Western Hemisphere. Further tension followed with the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, in which US President John F. Kennedy supported a failed attempt by Cuban exiles to overthrow Castro. The invasion was a disaster. Castro's forces crushed the rebels, and the debacle humiliated the US on the world stage. But most importantly, it sealed Castro to an even tighter embrace by the USSR, thus guaranteeing Cuba's position as the USSR's closest ally. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev was not oblivious to this opportunity. The US had stationed nuclear missiles in Turkey already, which endangered the USSR and brought it immediately under direct danger. To somehow redress this balance and thus protect Cuba against potential future aggressions, Khrushchev resolved to station nuclear missiles on the island. His twin goals were now these: an end to US provocations against Cuba and strategic ascendancy by taking nuclear weapons just within striking range of American cities. For the Soviets, this was a bold play for power way to challenge US dominance and bring matters to negotiations over nuclear weapons. For the Americans, however, it was an intolerable threat that brought the Cold War to its doorstep. And as Soviet ships carried nuclear missiles to Cuba, the world unknowingly inched toward one of the most dangerous confrontations in human history. On October 14, 1962, a US U-2 spy plane photographed a Cuba airfield. On that photo was taken evidence of something no one thought to have expected: the presence of Soviet nuclear missile sites being constructed. No doubts remained. Secretly, medium and intermediate range ballistic missiles were on Cuban territory, capable of striking main American cities within minutes. It brought the White House into crisis mode. President John F. Kennedy and his top advisors proposed setting up the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, EXCOM, to decide on their next course of action. The stakes were high. These missiles went live, and the configuration of power was going to change dramatically, placing the United States at the mercy of a direct Soviet nuclear attack. Mounting tensions grew over the options that were weighing on Kennedy's mind. A direct military strike could destroy the missile sites, but would risk provoking Soviet retaliation. A full-scale invasion of Cuba would remove Castro, but might well start World War III. A more measured approach, a naval blockade, could stop additional Soviet weapons from landing on the island, but might not force the removal of the missiles already positioned on the island. While the US debated its response, public fear skyrocketed. The news of the crisis had yet to be released, but military forces quietly moved to DEFCON 2, the highest level of readiness short of actual war. Nuclear bombers stood by, ready to launch at a moment's notice. Across America, officials prepared fallout shelters, and citizens unknowingly went about their daily lives while their leaders struggled to prevent catastrophe. For 13 days, the world held its breath, because one wrong move would mean annihilation for all of humanity. The Cuban Missile Crisis had started, and never had humanity come so close to nuclear war. With Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba threatening the United States, President John F. Kennedy took a very high-stakes decision. He ordered a naval blockade, officially called a quarantine, around the island. The objectives were clear: to prevent further Soviet arms from reaching the shores of Cuba, and in return threaten the USSR with the dismantling of the missiles already in existence. On October 22, 1962, Kennedy appeared nationally on television, declaring the crisis to the global audience and giving the Soviet Union a harsh warning of dire consequences if the missiles were not dismantled. Khrushchev did not back off. Soviet ships carrying military equipment headed towards Cuba, testing Kennedy's resolve. Meanwhile, Soviet troops in Cuba were scrambling to ready missile sites for use. Each side teetered on the edge, at any moment to be plunged into full-blown nuclear war if anything went wrong. The world watched in breath-holding suspense as U.S. warships blocked Soviet vessels as they approached the quarantine line. If a Soviet ship broke through the blockade, the U.S. would be forced to return fire militarily, perhaps with devastating consequences. In Washington and Moscow, the military prepared for the worst. Nuclear bombers stood ready, missile silos readied for launch. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, frantic negotiations were in full swing. Khrushchev sent two messages, one proposing a diplomatic way out and one aggressively demanding U.S. concessions. At one point, a Soviet submarine carrying a nuclear torpedo was nearly fired upon by American forces, and its captain was able to narrowly avoid disaster. As the world tottered on the edge, one question hung in the air. Would diplomacy prevail, or was nuclear war inevitable? It was the secret negotiations, however, that mattered most in the world during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Whereas all public declarations and military maneuvers got a great deal of headlines, it was through the backchannel communications between the United States and the Soviet Union that avoided a nuclear catastrophe. On October 26, 1962, Khrushchev privately messaged President Kennedy, making a conciliatory offer. If the U.S. agreed not to invade the island, he would remove Soviet missiles from Cuba. This message did not go far enough. The following day, Khrushchev sent another letter that was tougher in tone, specifying that unless U.S. missiles were removed from Turkey, Soviet missiles in Cuba had to be removed as well. Under heavy pressure, Kennedy's administration worked day and night to draft a response. After several days of tense deliberation, Kennedy's team, led by Attorney General Robert Kennedy, agreed to a quid pro quo. The U.S. secretly agreed to withdraw its Jupiter missiles based in Turkey, which it had been contemplating for months but only delayed until it could attain this through diplomatic means. In return, the Soviet Union would dismantle its missile sites located in Cuba, which no longer threatened the United States. Khrushchev was confronted by hardliners from his party and desired to restore Soviet prestige, so he eventually relented to this compromise proposal. Kennedy's leadership finally sealed the issue during the crisis, but a major coup itself was secured through the deal. However, a retreat for Khrushchev would deepen political ructions that would eventually take him down within the Soviet Union. After this crisis, hard lessons had to be learned and learned by either side about such direct communication future of Cold War diplomacy. The Cuban Missile Crisis did not go through nuclear war, but its aftermath has far-reaching changes to the Cold War and the ways of international diplomacy. For the United States, President Kennedy became a firm leader who pushed the Soviets back. However, the fact that the missiles installed by the U.S. were secretly removed from Turkey, even when their presence could not be told in the newspapers, it had become clear that superpowers had to forgo some of their dreams with a looming nuclear apocalypse. For the Soviet Union, it was a humiliating climb down for Khrushchev, weakening him at home and eventually yielding to ousting in 1964. The Soviets responded, however, by rapidly escalating their nuclear buildup, determined to be outsmarted no more. Cuba itself remained under Castro's rule, but more integrated with Moscow than ever, grew increasingly resentful at being cut out of the final negotiations. The hotline was one direct communication link set up between Washington and Moscow for the prevention of future misunderstandings. The red telephone line itself symbolized the new era in diplomacy, for quick, clear communication was indispensable to avoiding a nuclear disaster. It also changed the attitude of the world toward nuclear weapons, for it stared into the abyss. The world realized how close it came to annihilation. There was an urge for new arms control measures. This included the 1963 Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, with provisions for the prohibition of all nuclear testing in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a turning point, a terrifying reminder of how fragile peace could be. but also a lesson in the power of diplomacy to avert catastrophe. This resulted in the Cuban Missile Crisis in a 13-day standoff, sending the world towards nuclear disaster. One wrong move sparking World War III. At such a point, it was suspended over the globe, hanging by hair over extinction, till rescued by cooler heads of the negotiators, withdrawing the disaster over their heads. Can it happen again with another such crisis? Has the Cuban Missile Crisis reshaped global diplomacy, or has it merely postponed a confrontation that was always inescapable? The shadow of that near apocalypse hangs large, and it raises some difficult questions about the true fragility of peace. But still, with a deep sigh of relief, the world could breathe as the Cold War changed in strange and surprising ways. Where will the next battlefield emerge? Will it unfold in the skies or beyond, into the vastness of space? Only time will reveal.